In Horizon Forbidden West, we have a variety of damage types we can use to take down machines and other enemies. However, the game doesn't explicitly teach you how all of these damage types work or how to use them most effectively. In fact, there are some damage types like Tear and Knockdown whose stats are either partially or completely hidden from us. I think Guerrilla did this because they want us to play and discover the game's mechanics more organically, which I do personally like, but I know a lot of you don't like to experiment as much as I do, and it can take away from your enjoyment of the game when you just want a clear answer on how something works. For example, what's the difference between elemental damage and elemental buildup? What's this tear damage all about? Are knockdowns random, or can we trigger them reliably? And do coils affect only certain types of damage, or all of them? Today, I'm going to answer all of those questions and more. I'll break down every damage type to show you how it works, and we'll discuss how to leverage each of them to improve your gameplay. We're going to pack a lot of information into this one, so settle in and let's go. Okay, let's start simple with impact damage. Impact damage is the damage your shots deal directly to a machine's health. Those numbers you're seeing when you hit a machine are impact damage numbers, telling you how much the machine's health you've degraded. Taking a look at almost any ammo type, we can see the impact damage icon, which is a downward pointing arrow. The only exceptions are elemental arrows and spikes, which instead show an elemental damage stat up there, and blast sling bombs, which either show elemental or explosive damage, both of which we'll talk about later. Now, impact damage is kind of your bread and butter, your workhorse, so to speak. For most playstyles, you need at least one weapon on your weapon wheel that's good at dishing out a lot of impact damage quickly so you can bring down a machine's health and end a fight fast. The weapons typically used for this are sharp shot bows, which deal very high damage concentrated in a single shot, and bolt blasters, which deal lots of relatively low damage shots very quickly. Warrior bows can also work well for high impact damage output when used with the spread shot weapon technique, allowing you to shoot 5 arrows at once. This makes the warrior bow a high DPS weapon similar to the bolt blaster. Regardless of the weapon you use, keep in mind that hitting armor plates reduces impact damage dramatically, 80% on regular machines and 95% on Apex variants. So for impact damage to be effective, you need to target unarmored areas, or better yet, weak points or components, which usually have an impact damage multiplier. It's also important to realize that sharpshot and hunter bows will only deal full impact damage when drawn long enough. To get full damage, you need to draw until you see the overdraw halo appear around the outside of the circle. If you fire before you see this halo, damage will be reduced by 50%. Of course, if you allow the halo to fully close and get the whiskers to indicate you've overdrawn, then your damage will be boosted by 15 to 25%, depending on the weapon's particular overdraw damage perk. You should also know that the underdrawing penalty and overdrawing buff apply to other damage types as well, such as our next one, tear damage. Tear damage is a pretty unique mechanic in the Horizon series. It doesn't deal damage directly to an enemy's health, but you can leverage it to remove external machine components and armor plates. Primarily, you'll use tear damage to remove components, but removing armor plates is useful in certain instances. For example, weak spots like the Thunderjaw's data nexus are protected under an armor plate, so you can use a weapon with good tear damage to expose weak spots like this, creating an opportunity to land higher damage shots. The tear damage icon is a broken shield, and you'll find it on sharpshot, hunter, and warrior bow arrows, as well as drill spikes on spike throwers and most shredders on shredder gauntlets. But you should also know that even though elemental shredders don't show a tear damage stat, they do deal tear damage. In fact, elemental shredders in particular can deal a lot of tear damage. If you want to learn more about that, I'll link my shredder gauntlet masterclass video down below. When using tear damage to remove machine components, it's important to understand that components have impact and tear damage thresholds, which are both hidden. If you deal more tear than impact, then you'll reach the tear threshold first and the component will be torn off, falling to the ground where you can loot it. However, if you reach the impact damage threshold first, then the component will be destroyed and you can't loot it. In either case, tearing off or destroying the component will usually disable a particular attack the machine uses that component for. But again, destroying it with impact damage won't allow you to loot it. This is important to understand when you're trying to get key upgrade resources to upgrade your gear, like a Thunderjaw tail. You'll want to make sure you're using a weapon and ammo type that deals more tear damage than impact to ensure you can remove the component instead of destroying it. When components are torn off, the tearing actually deals some extra impact damage, technically called removal damage, so you're not totally missing out on decreasing a machine's health by focusing on removing components. In fact, focusing on tearing off components is a very effective strategy as it will simultaneously deal damage, disable attacks, give you additional loot, and even potentially give you a powerful heavy weapon you can turn around and use on the machine. One of the better ammos to use for dealing tear damage are advanced hunter arrows on a hunter bow. Their tear damage stat is much higher than their impact, they're also cheap to craft and relatively quick to fire, and you can fire up to 3 at a time with the triple notch weapon technique. Although triple notch doesn't quite do triple damage, check out my video on secret combat mechanics to learn more about that. For particularly stubborn components that require a lot of tear, you can use tear precision arrows on a sharpshot bow. These have extremely high tear damage that's dealt through an explosion, so they deal tear damage in a radius around the impact site, which makes them especially useful for targeting small components that are hard to hit directly, like Dreadwing Metal Fangs. I'll also just mention again that shredders, particularly the shock and acid ones, are very good for dealing tear damage, especially when you can land the explosive throw after catching the disc 3 times. Up next, let's talk about elemental damage and buildup. Yes, those are actually 2 different types of damage, but they're closely related, so it's important to understand the distinction. Every elemental ammo, whether it's an arrow, bomb, spike, or tripwire, deals both elemental damage and buildup when striking an enemy. When looking at one of these ammo types in your inventory, elemental damage is the icon and number up top. Now, I prefer to think of elemental damage as elemental impact damage because it behaves pretty much identically to regular impact damage. In fact, I personally think the icon should be changed to look more like an impact damage icon. An enemy's health will be directly reduced based on the elemental damage stat. The only difference between this and regular impact damage is that elemental damage will either increase or decrease based on a machine's weakness or resistance to the particular element. You can check these strengths and weaknesses by either scanning a machine directly or checking its entry in the machine catalog. Upward pointing green arrows indicate elemental damage will be boosted. Downward red arrows indicate elemental damage will be reduced. But after all this, it's important to keep in mind that elemental damage is almost always very weak. If you're trying to deal damage directly to an enemy's health, you're much better off using one of the high impact damage weapons we discussed earlier. So the real focus of elemental ammo is the buildup stat, which is the lower icon with a small arrow overlaid on it. You'll notice this stat is much larger than the damage one. Similar to tear, elemental buildup doesn't directly deal damage to an enemy, but instead builds up until a threshold is reached, which then triggers an elemental state. You can see your progress towards building up the state by watching the elemental icon that appears above a machine as soon as you start hitting it with elemental ammo. As you continue to hit it with the same ammo type, the icon will fill with color from the bottom up, and when it becomes completely full, 2 things happen. A white circle appears around the edge of the icon, and the machine's body will get coated in the element. For example, machines frozen into the brittle state become coated in frost and freeze up for a few seconds. Now, that circle around the edge of the icon is a timer that shows you how much longer the elemental state will last. It's also useful to know that armor plates don't block elemental buildup, so you don't need to aim for unarmored areas. Aiming for weak spots or components won't build up elemental states any faster either, so you don't really need to worry about where you're aiming with elemental ammo. The one very important exception to that rule is that you can hit elemental canisters with a matching elemental arrow or bolt blaster bolt to trigger an elemental explosion, which deals a nice chunk of damage and immediately applies the elemental state to a machine, regardless of its level of resistance. Elemental states are very useful because they provide temporary advantages in combat. For example, the corroding state makes it easier to remove and deal damage through armor plates and doubles the chance of landing a critical hit. Just like elemental damage, elemental buildup is affected by a machine's elemental strengths and weaknesses. Look closely and you'll see that we have a few variations beyond just single green and red arrows. There can be double stacked arrows that indicate a machine is very weak or strong to a particular element, and there's even a triple red arrow icon that indicates a machine is immune to building up an elemental state. If you want to learn more about elemental states and what they're used for, I have a whole video where I deep dive into each one and I'll link it down below. The best weapons for inflicting elemental buildup are hunter bows with elemental arrows, especially the legendary Sun Scourge, and blast slings with elemental bombs, such as the corrosive blast sling. Okay, now let's talk about explosive damage. Dealt primarily with spike throwers and blast slings, explosive damage is excellent when you just want to brute force a bunch of damage on a machine. Like impact damage, it directly reduces an enemy's health, but unlike impact damage, it ignores armor plates and deals damage directly to the machine underneath, plus it has a large area of effect, so you don't need to be particularly accurate with it at all. These features make it great for destroying components hidden away behind armor plates or in difficult to reach locations, such as the chill water sacks on a shell snapper's belly. However, the trade-offs are that it doesn't get any damage multiplier for hitting weak spots or components. In fact, it actually destroys components instead of tearing them off, so you'll want to avoid using it when trying to harvest key upgrade resources. It's also worth noting that explosive damage only gets a 25% boost from a machine being in the brittle state, whereas impact damage can be boosted by up to 100%. Still, if you just want to deal a bunch of damage, it's tough to beat explosive bombs or spikes, especially when using them with some of the most powerful weapon techniques. Now, explosive damage is also unique in that it can be used to trigger knockdowns more easily than other ammo types, at least in theory. In the official guidebook, it says that explosive damage can be used to trigger a knockdown by hitting machines on any part of their body. However, myself and a few other people over on my Discord server, like Paris, have tested this and it doesn't seem to work as intended, at least not as of patch 1.17. For example, a Tremor Tusk has an explosive knockdown threshold of 500, and advanced explosive bombs deal 125 knockdown damage each. So it should only take hitting the Tremor Tusk with 4 bombs anywhere on its body to trigger a knockdown, but it takes way more than that. Hopefully this is a bug Gorilla will fix in a future patch, because using explosives to trigger knockdowns would be pretty useful. At the moment, explosives can work well to briefly knock down human enemies though, with advanced and cluster bombs on a blast sling being particularly effective for that. Thanks to Plusle for sharing that tip with me over on Discord. Let's talk about knockdown for a minute, by the way. Knockdown damage, or knockdown power as it's officially called, is a hidden damage type. You won't find stats for it on any ammo, but it can be used to trigger staggers, which are brief stumbling animations that can interrupt a machine's attack, and knockdowns, which are when a machine falls over and is stunned for 8 to 12 seconds, depending on its size, with bigger machines staying down longer. Knockdowns can be useful in a variety of ways, giving yourself a bit of breathing room during a fight, setting up a powerful attack on a component or weak spot, further immobilizing a machine by tying it down with a rope caster, or giving yourself an opportunity to override a machine. Every ammo type has a hidden knockdown damage stat, and every machine has hidden thresholds for triggering staggers and knockdowns. As I mentioned earlier, explosive ammo can theoretically trigger knockdowns by hitting a machine anywhere on its body, but with all other ammo types, you need to target specific hit zones to get a knockdown. For small machines, you can pretty much hit them anywhere except the head or neck. But for most of the medium and large machines, you need to hit them in the leg. Hitting them on other parts of the body can trigger staggers, but no matter how much knockdown damage you do, it won't trigger a knockdown unless you deal that damage to the legs. There are a few exceptions though. Slitherfangs don't have legs, so their knockdown hit zone is the whole midsection of their body, basically the part that stays on the ground when they raise their head up. Sunwings can be hit in the legs, but also the tail and lower portion of their body. Similarly, Stormbirds can be hit in the legs, tail, or anywhere on their torso. To make things even more complicated, the hit zones change when machines are sprinting. When they're charging towards you or running away, you can hit them anywhere on their body to trigger a knockdown. You still have to reach the hidden threshold for it to happen, but it's worth knowing that you don't need to target a leg or other specific zone in these situations. If you're interested in the various machine knockdown thresholds and the knockdown power of different ammo types, I'm working on a spreadsheet for you guys that has all of this info, and I'll link it down in the description as soon as it's ready. By the way, if you guys find that spreadsheet useful or enjoy these deep dive videos on combat mechanics, let me know by leaving a like down below. That helps me know what kind of content you guys want to see more of, and it also really helps out small channels like mine. Another damage type we should talk about is damage over time. Various ammo types can deal ongoing damage for a period of time after the initial hit. These include spike thrower drill spikes, shredder discs on shredder gauntlets, and tripcaster stagger beams. Certain elemental states, such as the corroding and burning states, also deal damage over time when triggered, and pools of these elements on the ground, referred to as residual damage areas, can do so as well. Most of those damage over time sources are pretty weak, but drill spikes and shredders can be particularly strong when used correctly. If you want to exploit damage over time on these weapons, it's important to realize that the damage over time ticks are calculated based on the initial impact damage, so increasing impact damage will also increase the damage over time. You can increase impact damage with various coils, which we'll discuss in a minute, and also by freezing machines into the brittle state first. There are specific damage over time coils, but generally it's better to boost the initial impact damage. Those coils are pretty nice to use on a tripcaster with stagger beams though. The last damage type to discuss is melee damage. Aloy deals melee damage with her spear, and you can think of it basically as impact damage. It simply reduces enemy health directly, just like impact damage. There's only one additional thing I would note about melee damage, which is that spear hits also deal both tear and knockdown damage. So with enough melee hits, you can remove enemy armor and trigger knockdowns. The power attack, which you can charge by holding R2, deals the greatest amount of all three types of damage. Okay, before we wrap things up, let's talk about how you can use coils to boost different damage types. For most damage types, there are corresponding coils that provide a nice boost. For example, we have specific coils for impact, tear, explosive, damage over time, knockdown power, and the various elements like frost. Any of these coils can be used to boost their respective damage type, and if you've got them, you should definitely consider using them, but they're often not the strongest or most versatile options. For example, impact coils max out at 12%, but stealth, close range, long range, and high ground coils go up to 25%. Of course, the trade-off is that these are more situational, but you should still certainly consider them. Coils like this can also be more versatile. The stealth, close range, long range, and high ground coils can all boost impact damage, but they can also be used to boost explosive damage. The most versatile versatile coils are Agility, Overdraw, and Concentration, which boost almost all damage types including Impact, Tear, Elemental Damage, Elemental Buildup, Explosive, and Knockdown. The trade-off with these is that their stats aren't quite as high, maxing out at 15%. But that's still quite good, and the versatility is worth it in my opinion. And yes, there is a 15% concentration coil, but there's only one per playthrough, and it's very difficult to get, at least as of patch 1.17. It comes from the Scorcher during the What Was Lost side quest, but you have to loot it extremely quickly before a cutscene begins. If you're wondering where to find specific coils, I'll link my video on coil locations down below. And I'll also link DF Chang aka Shadowfall's excellent guide on doing New Game Plus runs to farm all the best coils, as well as Blue's Clues' map and PDF version of the guide. Huge shout out to both of them for putting those resources together for the Horizon community. And a big shout out to Plusle, who created all the cool damage type emojis I've been using in this video for our Discord server. Alright guys, that's my guide on all the damage types in Forbidden West. Even if you spent a lot of time in Zero Dawn like myself, the new layers of complexity in Forbidden West can make some of these damage mechanics confusing to understand. So I hope I've been able to clear some things up for experienced and new players alike. If you guys enjoyed this video or learned something new, leaving a like down below would be much appreciated. And if you have questions about damage types or want to share a tip of your own, definitely leave me a comment while you're down there too. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.